Gwyn Ushla agus a cordia, is misha an talamh Pádraig O'Gaire, Uachtarán an Acadamh, agus tá anhas orm fáilte Crowe Galéir go dtí an Acadamh Ríoga na hÉireanna inniu. Good evening, I'm Professor Pat Gyrey, President of the Royal Irish Academy, and delighted to welcome you to the Royal Irish Academy this evening for our public discourse entitled Grangegorman, From the Era of Neglect to the Era of the Asylum and Back, ? And I think that question mark might turn out to be reasonably important when we go through the evening. Also present here this evening are the Academy Secretary, Professor Mary O'Dowd, and the Academy's Executive Director, Dr Siobhan O'Sullivan, and the Academy's Treasurer, Professor Mary Kelly. Academy Discourses are the oldest and most renowned series of talks in Ireland. The first discourses were presented in 1786. Historically, they were the occasion reserved for the most distinguished academics to first reveal and discuss their work in public. We now record these discourses and they are subsequently made available on the Academy's website. So if you feel sometime over the Christmas period that you've watched 1-2 Santa Claus movie too much and you're looking for something interesting, check out our discourses. You might find those nice with a glass of wine and a rare opening or a hot open fire, so watch out for that. Before we go in, we have some short Academy business to undertake. The minutes of our last discourse, Light Illuminates Innovation in Medicine and Climate Solutions, was held on the 16th of November 2023, and they were posted online. Since our members did not inform us of any issues with these minutes, I will take these as approved, and I will sign the minute book after discourse concludes. So we'll welcome our esteemed speakers for this evening's discourse. Brendan Kelly is Professor of Psychiatry at Trinity College Dublin, Consultant Psychiatrist at Tallaght University Hospital, and UCD Visiting Full Clinical Professor at the UCD School of Medicine in UCD. In addition to his medical degree, he holds master's degrees in epidemiology, an MSc, healthcare management, an MA, and Buddhist studies, an MA, and also an MA Jura Offici from the Trinity College Dublin. He holds doctorates in medicine, an MD, a history, PhD, and also a DGov in governance and a PhD in law, and a higher doctorate in history, D.Lit. I would say, Brendan, that was a lot of graduation dinners. Right, I hope you've been able to survive all of those. His recent book, Asylum, Inside Grangegorman, which is available outside for purchase, and there's only 11 shopping days to Christmas, so make use of that time. So it's available for purchase outside, and that was published by the Royal Irish Academy this year. He's a Fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, Royal College of Physicians of Ireland, and Trinity College Dublin. To his right is Catriona Crowe, and former Head of Special Projects at the National Archives of Ireland. She was manager of the Census Online project, which placed the Irish 1901 and 1911 censuses online free to access. She's a former president of the Women's History Association of Ireland and an honorary vice president of the Irish Labour History Society. She was elected as a member of the Royal Irish Academy in 2011. Now to the discourse, and I'll hand over to Professor Kelly and Dr. Crowe, and looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President, for that nice introduction. Brendan, you're the best qualified person I've ever met. You should clearly not just, well, you could run the country, but even if you ran the Department of Health, it might actually make a difference to our situation. Now, you are our preeminent historian on the history of mental illness and health and treatment in Ireland, with lots of books to your credit, including Hearing Voices, which is your sort of magisterial account of 19th and 20th century treatment of mental illness. So you're in a unique position. You're both a physician and a historian. And you're not just a physician or a historian, you're a historian who is writing about the very area in which you practice as a physician. Can you tell us about the advantages of that and perhaps some of the tensions that that might create?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Catriona. And thank you, President and the Academy, for having me here this evening. And thanks to everyone for coming along. Is the microphone working okay down there at the back? Nice wave. Perfect. So, Catriona, yes, I am a medical doctor. I qualified as a doctor, and when training to be a psychiatrist, I was working in the Central Mental Hospital in Dundrum at night on call, and I took to leafing through the old case books. And for those of you not familiar, the old hospital case books are these enormous volumes, very large, larger than the ones here in the shelves. And, you know, a patient's entire history in an institution might be summarized maybe 20, maybe 30 years over 2 or 3 pages in the 1800s, 1900s, often with photographs, sometimes letters from families. So while I was supposed to be working busily as an on-call doctor, I was stuck in this back room reading through these old archives. And this stimulated my interest in the history of psychiatry. So I, as mentioned with the qualifications, I went on and I did a PhD in history, started writing a little about the history. And, you know, practicing today, one can feel the pressures and forces that were brought to bear on doctors and clinicians that resulted in these large institutions happening. So I guess we're talking a good bit today about Grangegorman, which was later known as St. Brendan's Hospital in Grangegorman. I imagine many of you know where it is, just north of the river. And that was a very large institution. It operated for around 200 years and is essentially shut down now and transformed. But it filled up with patients very, very quickly. Some people who, based on the archives, might have been mentally ill. It's hard to tell. Some whom were likely intellectually disabled, some of whom were neither of those things and simply ended up in there for complex social reasons. And, you know, practicing today as a psychiatrist, I can feel all of those pressures towards institutionalization. You can feel it from, you know, over the 2 centuries, the police were responsible for a lot of committals. They were involved, and one can feel that today when people show up in Garda stations in states of great distress, and Gardaí don't know what to do. The pressure to admit people into hospital. I can feel it today, the same pressure as over the last 2 centuries, from organisations looking after homeless people who are out of other options and often get in touch to say, I think this person is mentally ill, when maybe they're not, but there's no other option. So the pressures that led to these asylums growing, you know, me and most of my colleagues here in the room, and there's a number of psychiatrists, still feel these pressures towards the institution. I guess for me, it's particularly vivid because of my interest in it. So when I'm maybe seeing someone now in the emergency department, I'm thinking about 200 years of history and how this encounter fits into 2 centuries of psychiatric history, which is a very difficult way to conduct your day's business. You tend to get kind of caught up in things. But many of the pressures that led to these institutions and that I think we'll touch on, we can feel them today still.
Absolutely, and we will touch on that at a later point. Now, we're here, as you said, to discuss your latest book, Asylum, published by the Academy. You can buy it outside, folks. Buy 2 or 3 copies and you'll have your Christmas presents problem solved. I want to ask you 2 questions first about the book. First of all, you've taken the option of showcasing patients in this book, which I think is a wonderful decision to make. Was that your primary objective in writing this book, or did you want to do more than that? And you do more than that, but your primary objective was, I think, to try to retrieve lost voices that are very hard to retrieve even in the Grangegorman records. Maybe tell us about that a bit? Yeah,
exactly. I mean, the history of this field, mental health care, psychiatry, it tends to focus on institutions because they're relatively easy to study. They have histories, they have minutes, they have locations. You kind of know where they start and where they end. So some years ago, I wrote a different book called Hearing Voices, The History of Psychiatry in Ireland. And the effort with that book was to give sort of a central narrative to the field of the history of psychiatry. It was an imperfect book, but I felt the field needed a sort of someone to say this is the history, so that everyone else could come from different angles and say, oh no, it isn't. You omitted this, there's not enough, you should have told a Marxist history, you should have told a feminist history, you should have told a socialist history. But the field, I felt, needed that central narrative for everyone else to give out about. And that's my justification for its response over previous years. But that being done, that was very much an official type history, a very formal type history. And at the start of it, I do reflect on the absence of patients' voices. In other words, a granular understanding of the experience of what it was like to be in one of these large institutions. We are very short on patient voices from this history, very short. Some of you might be familiar with Bird's Nest Soup, which is a novel, but it's really very much based on a person's own experience of St. Loman's Hospital in Mullingar. And there was also a very interesting book called It Happened in Ireland, published in the 1930s, a patient's account of time in Monaghan Asylum. But apart from that, the voices of patients were very much absent. So in this book, I tried to move a little closer to that, certainly closer to their stories. So the book contains many, many case histories from the archives of Grangegorman, from the late 1800s, early 1900s and onwards. And these are the stories from the medical records about how people ended up there, how they got on there, and what happened. Were they discharged? Did they die in the institution? Were they moved to another institution? So there are many, many stories told from the case records of the institution, but sometimes with some supplementary materials. Sometimes the case books contain newspaper articles. They all contain photographs of patients. Sometimes there are letters from the patients' families in the archive, and sometimes there are writings and drawings made by patients. Sometimes voluminously, sometimes quite curt. So it was, if you like, moving a bit away from the institutional history towards patient stories using medical records. And of course, medical records, they are one version of the story written down by doctors and staff. I would like to move closer and, find more first-person accounts. And there are some. In the book, there is one man who writes a great deal about his experiences, but it's a very thought-disordered account. But yeah, it was an effort to get closer to the stories, although I'm still looking for that missing diary or letters or something closer again.
As everyone who's interested in social history longs to do with people who don't tend to leave memoirs and diaries behind them. There is one chap who is reported verbatim in the doctor's notes describing what he thinks is wrong with him, that his brain was removed and replaced with someone else's brain, and that he knows things he shouldn't know and has seen things he shouldn't have seen. He knows the entire Bible, and as he said, everyone knows that Catholics don't read the Bible, so it must be a Protestant brain. It's a fascinating moment. But that's very unusual, where the doctor took the trouble to transcribe, we hope accurately, what that patient had to say. But you begin the book with the story of Mary C. That's your first outing from the archives, where her sister writes her an extraordinary letter, wishing something for her that you wouldn't imagine she would wish for her. Perhaps you'll read the letter for us, Brendan.
So this is at the start of the book, and it concerns a person called Mary G., who I call her that. She was admitted to Grangegorman in early 1908. So she was a 28-year-old woman with a baby of 3 months old. She had refused food for 6 days, and the notes say that she heard tapping at night. People followed her. They hear everything she says. She hears people who are dead, and when asked her name, she said Queen Victoria. So she's 28 years old with a 3-month baby, and she sounds, by any standards, to be in a distressed state. So she was admitted to Grangegorman, and 2 weeks later, she said she was hearing voices but didn't know what they said. And then the record skips to 1 year later. She's still in there. And there's no record of what happened to the baby, by the way, no record of the 3-month-old. So 1 year after committal, she's now 29. She's described as very dull, does not know where I am. And then after 2.5 years, she is described as dull again. And 3 months later, she's described as dying of tuberculosis, which was very common in the asylum. So she was now about 31 years old in Grangegorman and dying of tuberculosis when her sister wrote to her from London. And here's the letter from the sister in London to Mary in the hospital. My dear sister, I hear from the doctor that you cannot live long. I am not surprised, as it was the opinion I formed when I saw you last August. Now, what I want to know is there anything you would like you cannot get in the hospital? I mean in the way of fruit or cakes. If you will let me know, I will send money. I am sure the nurses would get you anything. I will not say I am sorry you are dying. I will not say I am sorry you are dying. The wonder to me is you have lived so long, considering what you must have suffered the last 10 years in poverty in Dublin. Hoping you will have a happy death if you are not already reaping the reward of all your sufferings here. Your affectionate sister, Jane. So in Mary's file, the doctor recorded that Mary's, quote, Mary's sister gave her the appended letter, which I did not give her. And 2 days later, Mary died, having never seen the letter written to her by her sister. Now, this is a very interesting story, and it immediately jumped out at me, not because it was unusual, but because it was typical. And it gets to the heart of the complexity of these institutions. Like, I have no doubt that Mary's sister in London was likely a kind person and would likely have helped Mary if she could, but we don't know the circumstances of the sister in London. And time and again in the archives, one comes across this, which is people who are abandoned by families, by communities, and also abandoned in some ways by the staff or the doctors in the institutions who maybe could have tried harder to push for discharge. But at the time, a family member had to take responsibility for a person. There was no letting someone just walk out the gate. So while the hospitals often seemed cold and cruel and were, they do need to be looked at in the context of a society that wasn't exactly welcoming. Families that were under-resourced for dealing with someone who maybe was poor, maybe intellectually disabled, maybe awkward, or maybe just unwanted. So for all of these admissions, there were contexts, and I felt that story, that letter, really brought it out to me. There was some kindness, but it sounds so harsh to our ears today, almost unbearably so.
It does. It's a very scary letter. But you managed to humanize it and give us a sense that, as you just did, sometimes it's beyond the capabilities of families to rescue their relatives from these huge institutions. Now, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, are you tempted to retrospectively diagnose as you go through these notes? Things are called different names now. Depression used to be called melancholia at one stage. There were different words for what we now call different things. What is it, the DSM, the thing that tells you what everything is, which changes radically from one edition to the next? Where the whole business of description of mental illness is really fluid. So if you look at Mary, one of the obvious things to think about is she has a child who's 3 months old. How would you diagnose her now or retrospectively if you're just looking at that situation as it was then?
So look, to answer your first question, yes, obviously I am very tempted to diagnose people using the understandings and the language of today and applying them to notes from centuries ago. I'm very aware of my instinct to do that, for sure. And the man who had his brain replaced with another brain that was clearly a Protestant brain, that kind of thing still goes on, by which I mean, not that Protestant brains are put into people, but by which I mean, although...
Might be any harm sometimes.
Anyway, sorry, no. So that form of symptom is still very familiar, but I do hold myself back from diagnosing. I think, diagnosing is obviously a very contested thing in any case in psychiatry. And for those who don't know what DSM is, it's a diagnostic system for things like depression and bipolar disorder and so forth, all of which are conditions for which there are no blood tests, no brain scans. They're based entirely on symptoms. So there are diagnostic systems to give some guidance about severity and duration. Now look, it's all about grey areas. Things need to be considered in the context of people's lives. and not used in a tick box fashion. These are very limited systems even today. But if we do take Mary, look, a 3-month-old baby, and she's in a state of distress. That's as far as I would go diagnostically, and I think that's fair. I mean, I could go a little bit further and say maybe she had some features of psychosis. In other words, she appeared to believe things that were not true or hear things that were not there. But to be honest, it's kind of explicable in the context of her circumstance. I can only imagine her home circumstances were difficult and complicated to produce this picture. Yeah, so she might have to call it a postpartum mental illness would just be to say that she was distressed having, recently given birth. It doesn't really add anything to the description. So I keep myself in check. I keep the diagnostician in check as best I can.
Your rigour does you great credit, Doctor. That brings us, I think, to one of the issues that you write quite a bit about and have done before, which is the different kinds of treatment available based on diagnoses that were available to psychiatrists and doctors back then, like moral management, malaria treatment, insulin treatment, comas, cold baths, ECT, which we're all aware of, antipsychotics, antidepressants, and talk therapy. Would you talk us through the development of treatment of mental illness in Ireland? And please explain how we missed Freud.
Oh, yes. Cool. Yeah, so look, the history of psychiatry is a history of therapeutic enthusiasm. What we keep doing is we keep getting these new ideas and becoming tremendously enthusiastic about them. So this started really in the early 1800s with the idea of building institutions, building mental hospitals, the idea that segregation was a treatment. Not necessarily for safety, segregation itself. So we built all these institutions in the 1800s, and the idea in them was known as moral management. Now, moral meant different to what moral means today. We have a very narrow view of the word today, but this meant that each patient was to be treated as an individual. Their treatment involved the use of reason, emotion, activity, exercise, and a good diet. That was the idea. And moving away from the pre-asylum era, where people were constrained in huts and in private dwellings, and they were chained up and so forth. This was enlightenment was happening in the institutions. But as they grew, or as time went on, the institutions became too big, and attention shifted from managing individual problems to managing crowds of people in huge, unhygienic hospitals where 10 or 12% of patients died every year from infectious diseases. So as the 1800s went on and we built more and more of these hospitals, it reached something of a crisis point at the start of the 20th century. And the doctors who were by now in charge of the institutions, they weren't always, but by now they were, introduced a series of what can only be called rather desperate therapies to try and empty the institutions. So you mentioned malaria therapy. So there was a condition called GPI, general paralysis of the insane, which was basically advanced syphilis affecting the brain. And this was a big problem. It's not a problem now, but it was a problem. And the idea emerged that giving people a fever, a high temperature, would cure this. And the quickest way to give people a high temperature was to give them malaria. So they got mosquitoes, malarial mosquitoes, to bite people, gave them malaria, so they had a few very high fevers, treated them with quinine, so they got better from the malaria and from the general paralysis of the insane. The really weird thing about this treatment is that there's a lot of evidence it was effective. And the death rate from GPI fell dramatically, and the person who instigated the treatment won a Nobel Prize for it. So we'll never know how this happened because we don't see this anymore, nor do people get given malaria deliberately. Now, we did struggle with this therapy in Ireland. It was introduced in Grangegorman, but the mosquitoes kept dying because it was too cold. So what the doctor there did, Dr. Dunn, is he got infected blood serum flown in from London and gave people malaria in that way. But reading about the good intentions at the start is certainly a very sobering thing to read. Lobotomies were performed here on Grangegorman patients in the Richmond Surgical Hospital. You know, that lovely red brick Richmond building. It became a courthouse for a while. We didn't do that many lobotomies here in Ireland, not as many as other countries. Our fundamental belief was always in the institution. So while we response in the body, particularly when the initial problem, the syphilis, is an infection as well. So it's not wildly off the map the way that other things we did were. But yeah, look, broadly speaking, it did not work to the extent that we would recommend it today.
Mm-hmm. Why did we miss Freud? Why is there no emphasis on talk therapy in your account of the treatment of mental illness in the dates that you cover?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So Freud and his psychoanalysis swept the world and transformed the practice of psychiatry in many countries, including most notably the US, where they just took to it with enormous enthusiasm. It didn't even impact here in Ireland. In the 1940s, there was exactly 4 psychoanalysts in Ireland, all in private practice and all living in Monkstown, interestingly. Maybe if we've someone from Monkstown, they could explain that to me. There was actually a commune in Monkstown. Anyway.
Brendan, your next book?
So, a couple of things about this. First, Irish psychiatry has always been, and kind of still is, suspicious of any form of ideology at all. So there wasn't really a sort of flourishing intellectual debate about this or anything really in Irish mental hospitals at the time. The other issue here, and we might as well jump to this now, is the Roman Catholic Church. So the church opposed psychoanalysis. It just didn't like it. And there was an extraordinary book published, an Irish book called The Priest and Mental Health. And Archbishop McQuaid laid out the position quite clearly that psychoanalysis was trying to create a new reality, and only God could do that. So there wasn't much interest to begin with. The church wasn't enthused. But the church is so interesting because the mental hospitals were secular. They were not run by the church. These were not church institutions. And this is very interesting because, as we all know, the church was involved in the running of many institutions in this country. And we've had inquiries and look-backs into all kinds of things, the mother and baby homes, the Magdalene laundries, industrial schools, all kinds of things. But when you look at the magnitude of these institutions, say in the 1950s, on any given night, there were about 20,000 people in mental hospitals, 20,000. And if you add up all these other institutions, mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries, orphanages, industrial schools, and the prisons even, add them all together, they didn't come to more than 10,000. So at any given moment, the mental hospitals, secular institutions, were more than double the size of all the others put together. And yet there is this remarkable lack of focus on them in Ireland's institutional history. And my own theory is that we have developed what has become a comfortable narrative of Irish history, which is that the Irish institutional history maybe, which is that the church brought all of this to us, and that the church was this external entity, nothing to do with us, that brought evil. Now, we know the church is responsible for so many of those cold and cruel institutions which have been rightly looked into, but we don't have that explanation for why the mental hospitals were so big. And this is very uncomfortable for some people because it requires another story. It requires a different explanation. Obviously, the next fallback explanation is to blame the British, because that's usually quite a good one. But we have another bit of bad news here, unfortunately. While, of course, these institutions started, in the 1800s, the 1920s didn't change anything. If anything, the institutions accelerated over the following decades. So it's all quite awkward. And I suppose if we can't blame the church and we can't blame the British, we can blame the doctors, which is the likes of me. And this is true to an extent. For a good bit of the history of these places, you didn't need a medical certificate for admission. It was decided by a board of governors that was non-medical. And there were many, many social admissions. So we can, doctors, people like me do need to take responsibility for some of this, but by no means the greater part of it, but a significant part of it for sure. But your question, Catriona, was why Freud didn't impact. So you got an awful lot more than you bargained for there.
Well,
Sorry.
you've given me a pretty comprehensive set of reasons for that. And of course, it is fascinating that the biggest institutions we had were not run by the Catholic Church. And it's something everyone should remember. Mary Raftery, the great journalist, was a dear friend of mine. And when she had finished doing her splendid work, particularly on industrial schools, which did change our perception completely about what people had suffered in those places, her next target was going to be the mental hospitals. She was getting ready to look into that and to create another set of documentaries, and unfortunately she died far too young at the age of 52. But she saw it, and she was also fascinated by the fact that this was a secular system, not run by the church. You looked at the possible people to blame. I think I'm going to have to get you to tell us what Grangegorman might have been like at the height of its numbers, which would have been when, in the 1950s perhaps? Just give us a sense of what that place was like to be in. And I'm also, maybe you could do a rider on that, which is, did people actually get treatment? I mean, we discussed mosquitoes and malaria and insulin and lobotomies, but did most people get no treatment at all? Was the fact that they were in the institution assumed to be enough?
Yeah, a lot of the historical attention focuses on the treatment given, but most people did not get treatment. Most people were just sitting there for a very long time. There were two kinds of patients for most of the history. There was a churning of patients in and out, and then there was a long stay population. And these were in some ways quite distinct. I was talking to an eminent playwright about how to portray the life of a patient in a 2-hour play. And the correct thing to do was to have an actor play the patient, sit in a chair for 2 hours, and nothing happens. Nothing at all. No treatment, no nothing. That idea was dismissed as not dramatically feasible. So much for authenticity.
Beckett would have approved.
And indeed, yeah. So most people didn't get treatment. The institution was seen as enough. So the places were huge. They were overcrowded. They were vast. So some of these places had maybe 2,000 patients. So if you can imagine any institution that large, it has hundreds of staff members coming and going every day. So the gates of the asylum were very busy. People in and out all the time. Visits were allowed, people were in and out. The asylums were in some senses self-sufficient, certainly in the earlier years, in the 1800s and the early 20th century. Many of them had farms, including Grangegorman. They had their own fire brigade, so large were they. They often had bakeries, obviously, vast kitchens, refectories, laundries, all these trades persons. They had a team of carpenters, they had builders. Patients also did work. They worked in the laundry or on maintenance and in the fields. So they were very busy places. They were very powerful places as well. That is important to note. And in the book I mentioned the example of St. Bridget's in Ballinasloe. You know, in the 1940s, at its peak, St. Bridget's had a patient population of 2,100. Okay, so Ballinasloe town had a population of 5,600, and of those, 2,100 were patients in St. Bridget's. So that's nearly half the town. So the other half either worked in it, had a family member in it, supplied it, or something like that. So efforts to close them down or to scale them down met huge opposition, because these were such economic powerhouses. When they were building them, towns competed for the contracts. The contracts for building these places were massive. When Grangegorman became too full at the end of the 1800s, they built a branch asylum in Portrane, St. Ita's. Does anyone know Ita's? You'll know it to see for sure. And it was really interesting. When that hospital building contract was awarded, it was the biggest contract ever awarded by the state. This hospital building contract went over time. It went over budget, so that no one could ever figure out how much it cost in the end. Questions were constantly asked in Parliament about this contract and this building project. So, you know, we have to be careful about drawing lessons from history, but I hope some of you are hearing echoes in that. So life in these places was different for different people. Some patients came and went. So, for example, particularly before you needed a medical certificate for admission, sometimes a family who had a family member who might be disabled or, you know, unusual or eccentric or awkward or something, they would put them into the asylum for the winter, in the winter, and then take them out at the end of the summer to work on the farm and then put them back in for again. So that was known as wintering in. And this is what happens when you've big institutions, which is that families and communities start to use them for their, you know, for their purposes. And it's why we need to really look at these institutions in their social contexts to understand why did the same people come and go every winter? That's the kind of thing that was going on. The other big question in the history is, you know, a lot of these institutions, particularly the church one, focused particularly on women rather than men. And the asylums are interesting in this regard, because when you look at the statistics, they're roughly 50-50 male-female, the admissions. If anything, I see a tendency for women to be discharged a little bit earlier than men would be, for women to be less likely to receive the various treatments that were introduced. And that would be a tendency I tend to see in the records. But, sort of depressingly enough, if you look at the context, then this good news story for women doesn't last a minute. Because when you look at the reasons for discharge, you had husbands coming in imploring the discharge of their wives back to, back home for housework, for cooking, for cleaning. Such that when I was doing another book, although I couldn't pin this down to a source, there was this idea that women at a certain time sought to be admitted to the asylum. It was known as a holiday in the big house, just to step away from this cycle of housework, pregnancy, childbirth, bearing in mind that certainly in the early 1900s, pregnancy and childbirth held a significant risk to health and life. And there was really no way to step off that treadmill. So that's something I've been trying very hard to pin down in records, but it's something that was spoken of locally where I was working at the time. So I guess that life in the institutions, these were complicated places with complicated processes.
Yeah. I mean, we know, for example, that when the workhouse system was in existence, mainly in the 19th century, they ultimately became county homes, that people used clever agency to use those buildings, particularly for that wintering in system that you're describing, that people would move in for the winter to stay out of the cold, not to have to heat themselves, which is very clever use of sort of energy, if you think about it, and then come out again because they could. It's different in the mental hospitals, I suppose, because you can't just leave. Somebody has to come and get you. And that circumscribes people's agency in terms of using them in the way that you're describing. But there's no doubt that a clever wife could collude with a husband, presumably, although it might be the husband, the very person who's driving her in there to get a holiday in the big house, to actually get her out after a period of time. But there's endless interesting histories to be discovered there that aren't just simple. But however, we are looking at families, as you point out in the book, who are, for want of a better term, dumping unwanted relatives in these institutions. You did find much evidence of that in Grangegorman?
There's evidence of it in every single mental hospital across the country. And it varies, the flavour of it varies a little from place to place. So again, you go to Ballinasloe, it's towards the west of Ireland. A common thing in the record books there is that the asylum doctors would write to a family saying, your family member is now well, please, come and take them away, thanks. In other words, but the letter would be returned and written on it, scrawled in it by the postmistress or by the neighbours, gone to America. And what was happening was families were leaving Dublin to immigrate. They were heading west, and on the way they would leave a family member into St. Bridget's, and they'd continue and go. And Ag Dul Sir, it was called, going west, and it was a threat basically. So then. This all sounds like I'm really blaming families. I hope I'm really conveying that, families were in difficult positions about this kind of thing. And often were, when you look at it closely enough, doing things that maybe made sense for the family as a whole, but once the person was in the institution, it wasn't really in anyone's interest to work hard to get them out again. It was convenient. And I guess my profession needs to reflect on the degree to which we sort of co-conspired or let that happen. And getting back to your very first question, today, when people present looking for admission to psychiatric hospitals, very often they're in genuinely distressed states and circumstances. Like, I remember one case where 2 social workers arrived with a young man with intellectual disability saying he was suicidal. And I saw him and he was perfectly happy. I said, what's going on? And it was that his parents are elderly and can no longer cope. And there was no other option. And I remember thinking that night, goodness, like I really feel for this family. And I didn't admit him to an acute psychiatry unit. But if I had a big mental hospital with 2,000 beds, like there was, would I occasionally yield? I probably would. So to get back to your question about, when institutions exist,
yes,
they get used, and it's not always irrational, even if in retrospect it was clearly wrong.
I'm going to quote you to yourself now on the subject. Quote, institutions expand inexorably, deteriorate inevitably, and are ultimately dysfunctional.
Did I say that?
You did. I was very struck by the lovely symmetry of the phrase.
Thank you very much.
So let's think about that. I mean, I know you are one of the nicest people in Ireland, and we all know that about you. And everyone listens to you on the radio giving advice about how to have good mental health and all the nice things that you can tell us to do. And you're full of compassion and decency. But maybe you're being a little easy on the Irish family, which is the last unexplored institution we have in this country. Let's not forget John B. Keane opened up the door to all of that back in 1959 when he wrote Sive, which was refused by the Abbey Theatre, because Ernest Blythe, who was the director there at the time, said there are not people in Ireland like that. And of course, Sive is a story about two parents who sell their daughter for money to an old man. And John B., being a smart man, took the whole thing on the amateur circuit, and hundreds of thousands of people went to see Sive all around Ireland in the late 50s, early 60s. It's still a staple of the amateur circuit, as well as now a classic of the repertoire. I think there are things we have to look at a bit about families. You know, the father who drives his daughter to the gates of Castle Pollard Mother and Baby Home in 1945 and says, "Take a good look at me now because you'll never see me again." That is cruel, unusual treatment from a parent to a child.
It is for sure. And we'll go back to Mary Raftery again, because I remember talking to her and she mentioned psychiatric hospitals and the work. And I was saying, goodness, I said, well, what other institutions are left to be looked at? And she said, the big one, the family.
It's the family, yeah.
Is what she said. I said, well, that's not an institution. That's not how I understand institutions at all. But over the years, irritatingly enough, once again, she turns out to be correct and perceptive.
Sorry for your trouble.
Yeah. Well, look, no, I mean, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to understand the circumstances in which families made choices that were really, really difficult. And I might be a little bit too sort of empathic about that, but you know, it's like I saw this letter into Oma Asylum in 1862, I think it was, from a family saying, you know, thank you, doctor, for your letter. We're delighted that John, you know, the patient is now better and that you would like us to take him home. However, we cannot take him home. We cannot cope with him. It is best he stay in the asylum until he dies. Please write to us again after he has died. And sort of there's something again about the harshness of that, like the letter I read from the book about Mary, that makes me wonder what circumstance is it that leads to that? You know, people in the past were just as smart, just as intelligent, just as empathic as we are now. We often think they weren't, but they were. And I'm just interested in what led to that. And that's partly why I try and get into it a bit in the book here, trying to understand what generated these institutions. You know, there were other things, bad legislation, and of course, like the famine. In fairness, like someone asking me, why did the asylums grow, you know, in the 1840s and 1850s? There was a famine. And, you know, the asylum offered a place to sleep and reliable food and a degree of medical care.
As did the workhouses to a certain extent, although they were vastly overcrowded. You've sort of neatly brought me to something here in terms of your wondering about what exactly were the circumstances that forced people or made people come to these decisions about their relatives. You and I are both members of Grangegorman Histories, which is a wonderful project that involves the Royal Irish Academy as well as Dublin City Council, the Grangegorman Development Agency and TU Dublin, the Technological University, which is based on the new campus, that beautiful new campus that is there now to replace the place where nobody ever wanted to go. Now everybody wants to walk through these lovely plazas that are there. One of the things we're all aiming to do is to have the HSE, who have official custody of the records, the archives of mental hospitals, opened up for research, particularly to people like you who can make such good use of them. In this book, which is a really wonderful book and a really beautiful book too, because of Fidelma Slattery, the Royal Irish Academy's secret weapon, who was probably the best designer in Ireland when it comes to books. But it's a wonderful book, Brendan, and it is full of empathy and full of really interesting information about the patients. You anonymised the patients. Would you have preferred to be able to name them, to use their photographs, and in a way more important in research terms, to be able to connect the record that you're finding in the Grangegorman archive with other records? For example, you could find Mary with her 3-month-old baby in the census, perhaps, find out what family circumstances she came from. You could look at birth and death records, marriage records. All those kind of things could lead you into a deeper understanding of the family circumstances of patients. What's your view on that?
Yeah, so the records are, they're clinical records, they're medical records, and therefore they're subject to medical confidentiality, certainly I am. And the Medical Council ethical guidelines are clear that confidentiality persists after death. So that is certainly a restriction on identifying anybody through their name or their photograph or any other identifying detail. That said, looking at the medical records only really doesn't give the picture that we need, for sure. A lot of the mechanism of committal was something called the dangerous lunacy legislation of the 1840s, whereas if I decide that you are likely to commit a crime, you can get quite easily committed to prison and then a mental hospital. So you could spend a lot of time in jail. You could spend years in jail waiting for a bed in a mental hospital. So there would be a record of all of this, and it would be so interesting to know, like the arrivals in Grangegorman, they could have been in prison for 6 months, 3 years. Quite a number came from workhouses, end of life, clearly end of life.
Yeah.
And the photos would be so wonderful because one of the cases I mentioned, and I describe some of the photos in the book because I couldn't publish them, the woman was so ill she couldn't hold her head up. She was elderly and very ill. She clearly had a stroke or some kind of advanced condition. She couldn't hold her head for the photo, so the asylum staff are holding her head up for the photograph, and she died after a couple of weeks in the institution. She was sent to die. So I would very much like to show those photos, but so it would be wonderful if this was opened up more as it is in other countries, in other jurisdictions.
Yes.
Records more than 100 years old are open, and that would be very helpful if that could happen. And there's also an ethical issue here, because I'm very conscious that I'm using I'm using medical records. These are important, sensitive documents, and there's an ethics about it. I mean, that woman, Mary, I just took her story and I put it in my book. I didn't ask her permission because she was dead. I felt it was the right thing to do. But what I would really like to do is I would like to tell you her name. I'd like to tell you where she lived. I'd like to tell you how she lived, how she died, and put her photograph up on that screen so that, she would be, that her story would be here and that we would remember it and we would learn from it, from her. Now it's an anonymized story, which I will emphasize is still very good, just in terms of book sales. I don't want to talk it down. But ultimately, and maybe that would help us come to terms a little bit more. It would help us understand a little bit more. And it's so wrong for the system, if you like, to be defensive about this. Because if we could link these records to the court records, to workhouse records, we would undoubtedly see a context that made the institutionalization probably not justifiable, but more understandable. What's known as the funnel of betrayal, leading inexorably to the institution. And I think opening the records, allowing historians or whoever to link it to birth records, death records, prison records,
workhouse records, as you say.
Workhouse records, yeah. That would give the stories context, and it would help us understand. The other thing I will say to your question and your mention of Grangegorman Histories, which is to say Grangegorman Histories is a public history program, and you should look at the website, grangegormanhistories.ie. The chairperson of Grangegorman Histories is here and would speak to us sternly, Catriona, if we didn't say grangegormanhistories.ie.
Thank you for that rebuke, sir. And Philip, forgive me, Philip Cohen is the most engaged chairperson you could ever come across, absolutely up to his neck in involvement with the Grangegorman Histories Project, which we're all very proud of. Okay, we are hoping that that will happen, that the records will be opened up. Alas, because you are a practicing physician, you are subject to the Medical Council and will not be able to take advantage of that. But I think you've done an amazing job anyway with Asylum. Can I ask you what effect has come to you, if you like, from looking at the lives of these people, from reading these documents, from understanding the bits of their story that you can see? How does that affect you as an ordinary human being? You are a doctor, you have that sort of buffer zone, if you like, where you can think about diagnosis and so on. But you're also a human being like the rest of us. And I found the book incredibly moving and very sad at times, given what we were asked to reflect on. But I would not ever not have read it. I think it's a huge education for all of us and a really important and moving and quite beautiful book in many ways. How has it affected you, Brendan?
Well, these are very, some of the stories are very, very sad. And, and it's interesting when you talk to some of the staff who worked, particularly in Grangegorman towards the end of its time, and when you talk to some patients who were there, they often recall acts of kindness, and the staff were often kind, in an interpersonal way. But, they were kind in a very structured institutional context. And I finished the book with a little reflection on this, saying that kindness is nice. It's better than unkindness, but freedom is better. And, freedom wins hands down every time. So it certainly has made me think more about systems of care and the structure of care. And it's important to be kind and compassionate at level of individual care, but we also need to think about what the system is doing, bigger things, numbers of beds. Like, for example, today, right now, this minute, Ireland went from, in the 1950s, having more psychiatric inpatient beds per head of population than any country in the world before or since in the 1950s. Today, we have the third lowest number of psychiatry inpatient beds in the EU. So it certainly made me very aware of that pendulum, which has really swung, particularly in Ireland. We've had this huge reaction to institutional psychiatric care. And it's impossible for me to know what somebody will sit here saying about me and us in 50 or 100 years' time. And it is foolish to speculate, but being a fool, I will. I anticipate this will be seen as an era of neglect, when the biggest issue is not protecting people from over-exuberant interventions by psychiatrists. The biggest issue is accessing care. I mean, we pay a price for our low number of psychiatric beds, mentally ill people who are homeless, and large numbers in prison. But I have to say, on balance, I am seized by the dangers of institutions. And I think maybe the pendulum has swung too far, but I am glad it has swung.
That was the question I was going to ask you next. Where are we now? Where do you think we should be? Have we thrown the baby out with the bathwater, to use the usual cliche? Are we now in a situation, we hear regularly about young people in particular seeking access to mental health care and not being able to get it, having to wait for very long periods of time before they can access it. What can we do to make that better?
Yeah, it's a hard one to know. I mean, the issue of throwing out the baby in the bathwater comes up a bit, and sometimes there isn't a baby in the bathwater. Sometimes it was just water and we're better off without it. And I'm not certain that much of a baby has travelled out with the institutional bath.
I'm just thinking of a great title now, Real Water with Imaginary Babies in it.
Okay, Catriona, I think we've worked this metaphor to within an inch of it. We're going to leave that metaphor now. So where are we now? Okay, so look, the ideas of a community-based mental health service are much, much better than the alternative, which is institutional care. However, a lot of studies show that community mental health care was introduced in a sort of a neoliberal way to save money. And any proper study will show community-based care costs as much as or more than institutional care. So we certainly need to reprioritize a little bit. But for me, the big thing from the historical work is the link with social care. a great deal of what I see in clinical practice that presents, now I work in the public sector only, no private practice.
Congratulations for that. Seriously.
Well, a great deal of what I see, there's so much social need woven into it. You know, I can see a homeless person with severe depression, and I can tell them to, or recommend they attend our psychologist, and I can give them antidepressant medicine, which they can store in a little bottle in their tent by the banks of the canal. So that's not going to work out. So what I would like to see is a much stronger awareness of the need for social care that is joined up with mental health care. I can do very, very little to help someone whose social problems are overwhelming them, and if they as an person, as an individual comes to see me, we're immediately structurally locating the pathology in the person, or occasionally in me maybe, but mainly in the person who comes, rather than the context. And that is really concerning. So what I would like to see is a much greater emphasis on meeting the social needs of people who are maybe mentally ill, if we use that word, but certainly have a collection of needs. I do think there is a difference between mental, something like schizophrenia or that, like it is a condition, it is a mental illness, and it's sort of, it's not just all about they had hallucinations, delusions, disturbed behavior. If you can imagine very advanced dementia, maybe very advanced Lewy body dementia, hugely distressing thing to see. And this created perhaps the greatest of this therapeutic enthusiasm, therapeutic desperation to do something for these people rather than just locking them in rooms and restraining them.
Where a lot of people might have seen it is in Ibsen's Ghosts, which there was a wonderful production of in the Abbey last year, and the young man in that succumbs at the end of it to syphilis. Yeah,
and so such a tragic condition, and as you say, it gets a mention in Ulysses, along with Dr. Connolly Norman, who he was a doctor who lived from 1853 to 1908. He was resident medical superintendent at Grangegorman, a very prominent figure, and he tried to introduce a lot of reforms. So, for example, he started a boarding out scheme where patients could go back and stay with their families for periods of time, or other families, if the families weren't willing to take them home permanently. If you like, a sort of a middle ground, a concession. But this was absolutely opposed by Dublin Castle, because remember, there was this huge political desire to keep the asylums big, to keep them employing people, paying for supplies. So he didn't succeed very much in relation to that. He did improve the institution in various ways. And one of his big contributions was, there was a younger doctor, her name was Eleonora Fleury. She worked in Grangegorman. And she was really good. She was academically the top of her class, gold medals, MD, but she couldn't join the Medico-Psychological Association. She couldn't, become a fully fledged resident medical superintendent because she was a woman. So Connolly Norman applied for her to be admitted in 1893 to the Medical Psychological Association. It was refused because she was a woman, but he was very influential and he managed to get the rules changed. So she was admitted in 1894 following a change in the rules, and she is, as best as we can figure, the first woman, let's say, psychiatrist or fully qualified asylum doctor in the world. We've looked in other countries, we can't find anyone, and I'm just linking it to Connolly Norman, not to diminish her ability, like she richly merited it, but she did need just this man to get the rules changed, and in fairness, he did. And he was one of these extraordinary figures as well. Like, he read Greek and Latin, he was interested in botany and archaeology, he donated his library to the Royal College of Physicians Heritage Centre, which is a fascinating place as well. And then he died in 1908 on the North Circular Road. He just collapsed. He'd had chest pain. He was attended to by Sir Thornley Stoker on the scene, Bram Stoker's brother. But alas, Connolly Norman died. He had tried very hard to reform the institution, and he is commemorated with a plaque in St. Patrick's Cathedral.
And he also has a house in Grangegorman called after him, Connolly Norman House. I think we're probably done for the moment, and we're going to have some questions and answers from the audience. Brendan, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
General, if I could ask a question maybe to wrap up at this stage, because we've had a very fantastic evening. So 1950s was the maximum in terms of numbers, and you said the pendulum have swung. So what's the current numbers, and is there any correlation between perhaps the number of suicides in the 1950s versus the number of suicides now? So is there any correlation whatsoever on that front?
Yeah, well, as I say, the number of psychiatry inpatient beds in Ireland now is low by international terms, and our rates of committal, that's the use of mental health legislation for treatment against a person's wishes, are low by international terms, less than half the rate in England, for example. So we have the pendulum has seriously swung around here. And your point about suicide it's an interesting and really quite a complicated type question. It is, and I just apologize because I know in a room like this, when we talk about this topic, there will undoubtedly be people whose lives have been impacted by self-harm, maybe bereaved by suicide. But I'll go ahead and answer the question anyway. It's very difficult to know about statistics over time. Methods of collecting statistics have changed. But we have a good news story here, which is never told, and I'm going to tell it now, which is that over the 3 decades between 1990 and 2018, the rate of suicide in the world declined by 1/3. It was one of the biggest public health shifts of our lifetimes, is the global decline in suicide, and it's continuing to decline. It's falling globally, a massive change in the world. And I used to talk about this. I used to say it was the biggest public health shift of our lifetimes. But then COVID came along, and in fairness to COVID, that was the biggest public health event of our lifetimes. But this is the biggest positive public health event. Now, I want to be absolutely clear that this does not mean in any way that self-harm and suicide are solved, are no longer a problem. Even one is one too many. Is that okay? No one is born wanting to self-harm. That, somehow we as a society, we do this. But if it is possible that the global rate of suicide can fall by 1/3, then it can fall by another 1/3. We should be able to do that. It means that positive change is possible. So I don't listen to people who are fatalistic or negative about this kind of thing. If there can be such a huge shift in global public mental health, then we can do that again and bring it down by another 1/3. And there are lots of reasons why it fell globally. Now, some countries are a little different, particularly small countries like Ireland. Our rates fluctuate more, but the overall pattern globally is very, very clear and is very positive. But just to be absolutely clear, I am not saying the job is anywhere near done. Even one is one too many, and statistics mean virtually nothing to someone who has personal experience of this. I do understand that. But I do want to end on something of a positive note, which is that positive change in mental health is possible. We can talk all day about should we have more beds or fewer beds or whatever. What we need are more services, more ways for people to connect and to support each other, and positive change is possible on a massive scale. I mean, that's a massive shift in the suicide rate, and we can do that again.
Great. So can I finish up by thanking Catriona for a series of thought-provoking and interesting questions, and thank Brendan for dealing with all of those questions, but actually giving some fantastic, engaging answers. It was a very interesting evening, I have to say. I'd like to thank our Secretary of the Academy, Professor Mary Dowd, for organising the Academy's Discourse programme. The next Academy Discourse is a date for your diary. It's called The Geometry of Chaos, From Climate Change to Foundations of Quantum Physics. Will be on Wednesday, the 7th of February at 6 o'clock, given by Professor Tim Palmer, a Royal Society research professor, an honorary member of the Royal Irish Academy, and he's currently at the University of Oxford. And details of this event are on the Academy website, www.raa.ie, and I hope that you will be able to join us then. Thank you all for attending this evening's discourse, and do please join us now for refreshments in the front room. Gorv Mahagwith, August Nolik Honagwith Galer.